The message arrived at 2:17 in the morning, from a number I had deleted years ago, not blocked, just erased. I didn't want the reminder sitting in my contacts, even though I knew the digits by heart. When the screen lit up, I recognized it before my eyes even focused. If you still want answers, meet me tomorrow. No name. No explanation. Just a time and a place I didn't recognize. I stared at the message long enough for the phone to dim and go black. For a minute I thought about pretending I never saw it. It had been almost 4 years. 4 years of silence that I had convinced myself was permanent. Still, my chest tightened the same way it used to when I heard footsteps outside my apartment door late at night. Back then, every sound meant possibility. Every notification meant hope. Now it just meant something unfinished. I picked the phone back up and read the message again. Same words. No apology. No greeting. Just that cold promise, answers. I had imagined this moment more times than I wanted to admit. What I would say. What I would ask. How calm I would sound. In those daydreams, I always walked away feeling lighter, but sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, I felt heavier than I had in years. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the conversation history, or what was left of it. Just a handful of old messages. Logistics. Half-finished plans. Nothing meaningful survived the nights when I had gone through and deleted everything in quiet bursts of anger. It struck me how strange it was that someone could disappear from your life but still leave a shape behind, like furniture removed from a room. You don't see it anymore, but you remember exactly where it stood. The meeting time was less than 12 hours away. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back, fully awake, already knowing I was going to go. I just didn't know what part of me was still waiting for this. I first met her during a stretch of my life that felt steady enough to trust. I had a routine, a small apartment that always smelled faintly like burnt coffee, and a job that didn't excite me but paid on time. Most evenings looked the same: quiet dinners, background noise from the television, and long stretches where nothing really happened. I used to think that kind of calm meant things were going right. She came into it without much warning. A mutual acquaintance invited both of us to a small get-together, the kind where people stand around pretending they enjoy cheap drinks. She didn't talk much at first, but when she did, she focused on whoever she was speaking to like the rest of the room didn't exist. When it was my turn, I noticed how comfortable the silence felt between sentences. That stayed with me longer than anything she actually said. We started seeing each other after that. Nothing dramatic. Just small routines forming where there hadn't been any before. She'd leave her jacket on the back of my chair like it already belonged there. Sometimes she stayed overnight without asking, moving around the kitchen in the morning as if she had memorized the layout. I remember thinking how natural it felt, which in hindsight should have made me more cautious. She rarely talked about her past. When I asked simple things, old jobs, old friends, even where she had lived before, her answers stayed vague. Not evasive exactly, just incomplete. At the time I convinced myself it meant she valued privacy. What mattered more was how present she seemed with me, or at least, how present I believed she was. The strange part is that the ending didn't begin with a fight, it began with a silence that stretched one day too long. At first, the silence didn't feel unusual. We weren't the kind of couple who needed constant contact. Some days we barely texted at all, and when we did, it was usually short messages, grocery lists, half-jokes, reminders about plans. It felt mature in a quiet way, like we trusted each other enough not to fill every gap with noise. So when she didn't respond for a day, I barely noticed. On the second day, I told myself she was busy. She had mentioned a project at work that was taking longer than expected. I pictured her staying late somewhere, phone buried in a bag, completely absorbed. By the third day, I started checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit. Not constantly. Just enough that I caught myself doing it. I reread our last conversation, nothing strange, nothing unfinished. Just a short exchange about meeting later that week. She never showed up for that. I went to her place that evening, expecting some simple explanation. Maybe she'd been sick, or lost her phone, or had some minor crisis she didn't want to explain over text. The building looked exactly the same. The same dim hallway light. The same faint smell of cleaning chemicals that never quite disappeared, but when I knocked, no one answered. I waited longer than necessary, listening for movement on the other side of the door. Eventually I knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. On the way out, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Her name wasn't on the mailbox anymore, it had been replaced by a blank plastic strip, as if no one had lived there for a long time. That was the first moment I understood this wasn't going to be a simple explanation, but even then, I didn't think she had disappeared on purpose. I thought something must have happened to her. For the next few weeks, I operated under the assumption that something had gone wrong. It was easier to believe that than anything else. People don't just remove their names from mailboxes and vanish without warning. Not people you've spent almost 2 years with. Not someone who kept a toothbrush in your bathroom and a spare key in your drawer. I called her phone every morning on my way to work. It rang at first, which gave me a strange kind of comfort. A ringing phone meant the number still existed somewhere in the world. It meant she hadn't completely disappeared. After about 10 days, it started going straight to voicemail. I tried reaching out to the few people I knew she spoke to. But those conversations never went anywhere. Most of them seemed surprised to hear from me at all. A couple admitted they hadn't heard from her recently either. One person told me she had mentioned possibly moving, but couldn't say where. That detail stuck with me. Moving was something you planned. Something you talked about. Something that required boxes and decisions and time. It didn't make sense that she would go through all of that without saying a word. The only person who gave me anything close to useful information was an older neighbor from her building. I ran into him outside one afternoon when I went back again, hoping maybe I had just missed her before. He studied me for a moment before speaking. Like he was deciding whether I deserved an answer, then he said she'd left quickly. No goodbye party. No moving truck parked out front for days. Just a few trips carrying bags and boxes to a small car. Looked like she didn't want anyone noticing, he said. I asked if she had been alone. He hesitated, then he said he thought there might have been someone helping her. That single detail stayed with me longer than anything else. Someone helping her. At first, I told myself it didn't mean much. Moving alone is difficult, and she wasn't the type to struggle if she had another option. It could have been a coworker, a relative, anyone passing through for a few hours. A practical explanation existed if I wanted one badly enough, but my mind kept circling back to the same uncomfortable possibility, someone close enough to help her leave quietly. I went back to the building a few days later and tried talking to the neighbor again. This time he seemed less patient, like he had already said everything he intended to say. Still, he mentioned one small thing he hadn't brought up before. He remembered a car, nothing distinctive, just dark-colored, older, maybe a little dented along one side. The kind of vehicle you see 100 times and never think about again, but he was certain she hadn't been alone. I asked if he had seen the driver. He shook his head. Said the person stayed mostly near the car. Once or twice he noticed a figure moving near the trunk, but it had been early evening and the light was fading. What about a man or a woman? I asked. He shrugged. Could have been either. That answer bothered me more than certainty would have. My imagination filled in the gaps in ways that logic never could. For the first time, I started wondering if maybe I hadn't known her as well as I thought. I went home that night and looked through the few things she had left behind. A scarf folded in the back of my closet. A book with a receipt still tucked inside. An old hair tie on the bathroom counter that I had never thrown away. Ordinary objects, but they suddenly felt staged, like evidence from a life that had already ended. And for the first time, a different thought crept in, quiet but persistent. Maybe she hadn't disappeared, maybe she had left me. Once that idea settled in, everything started to look different. I replayed conversations in my head, searching for moments I might have missed. Small pauses. Half answers. Times when she seemed distracted while I was talking. Back then, I had taken those things as normal. Now they felt deliberate, like pieces of something I hadn't understood. I remembered how she sometimes turned her phone face down when it lit up. Not quickly or nervously, just casually, like it didn't matter. At the time, it never bothered me. Everyone had private conversations. I told myself trust meant not needing to check. Now I wondered what I had trusted. A few weeks after she disappeared, I tried something I had avoided before. I drove past the place where she used to work. I didn't plan to go inside. I told myself I only wanted to confirm she still worked there, just one solid fact to hold on to. but the parking lot was smaller than I remembered, and after sitting in the car for 10 minutes, I went in anyway. The person at the front desk looked confused when I mentioned her name. Not suspicious, just blank. He checked something on a computer, then shook his head. She hadn't worked there in months. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to process what he had said. Months meant she had still been coming over to my place. Still making plans. Still talking about work like everything was normal. It didn't line up. On the drive home, I felt something close to anger for the first time. Not explosive anger, just a slow pressure building behind my ribs. If she had been planning to leave, then she must have known exactly when it would happen, which meant there had been a moment, probably many moments, when she looked at me and already knew she was going to disappear, and she never said a word. After that, I stopped pretending I would just move on. For a while, finding her became a quiet routine I never talked about. Nothing dramatic, just small searches in spare moments. Old usernames I remembered, variations of her name typed into search bars, public records that never led anywhere solid. Most nights ended the same way, with too many open tabs and nothing useful to show for it. Every now and then I thought I had something. A profile picture that looked almost right. A comment written in a tone that sounded familiar. But the details never lined up. Different ages. Different histories. Different lives that clearly didn't belong to her. Still, I kept looking. Eventually I found something that felt more real than the rest. It wasn't even online. It came from a chance conversation with someone who had worked in the same building as her old job. He remembered her, but only vaguely. Said she had kept to herself. Quiet, polite, nothing memorable. The kind of person people forget quickly, but one thing stuck out to him. He said she used to get picked up sometimes, not every day. Just once in a while, usually in the evenings. I asked if he knew who it was. He hesitated before answering, like he wasn't sure how certain he felt. Then he said he thought it was probably her boyfriend. The word landed harder than I expected. Boyfriend. I didn't correct him right away. I just stood there, waiting to see if he would add anything else. Instead he described what he remembered. A man sitting in the driver's seat, engine running, never getting out of the car, patient, familiar, like he had done it many times before. That night I barely slept, not because I believed it completely, but because part of me did. For the first time, the story started to make a kind of sense. She hadn't disappeared, she had chosen someone else. For a while, that explanation settled into place so neatly that I almost felt relieved. If there had been someone else, then at least the disappearance had a reason. It meant I hadn't imagined everything. The distance, the half-answers, the quiet distractions, they could all belong to a story I simply wasn't part of anymore. It hurt in a clean, understandable way. Friends I never told directly still seemed to sense something had happened. A couple of them offered vague advice about letting go, about how people sometimes leave without explaining themselves. None of it felt especially helpful, but it matched the version of events I had started building in my head. Eventually, the search slowed down. Not because I stopped caring, but because I ran out of places to look. Life filled in the empty spaces whether I wanted it to or not. Work changed. I moved to a different apartment. The objects she had left behind disappeared one by one, not thrown out all at once, just gone gradually until I noticed they were no longer there. Time didn't erase the questions, but it dulled their edges. Every so often I imagined running into her somewhere unexpected. A store aisle, a train platform, a quiet street. In those imagined meetings, she always had an explanation ready. Something simple enough to understand, complicated enough to justify the silence. I never imagined she would be the one to reach out. Which is why the message felt so unreal sitting on my phone in the dark. If you still want answers, meet me tomorrow. By late morning, I was already on my way. The place she had chosen turned out to be a small cafe near the edge of town, the kind of place people passed without noticing. I arrived early and picked a seat where I could see the entrance. I expected nerves. Instead, what I felt most was certainty. I thought I already knew what she was going to say. I believed I was about to meet the man she left me for. When she walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different, she didn't, but because the person I had carried in my mind for all those years didn't belong to reality. The quiet, careful images I had built were sharper, smaller, more controllable. This version of her carried a weight I hadn't imagined. She smiled, not warmly, not apologetically, just a small, measured tilt of her lips that reminded me how precise she had always been. She didn't sit immediately. She lingered at the doorway, scanning the cafe like she had a plan, like she already knew exactly what she would do next. I gestured to the empty chair across from me, heart thudding in ways I didn't expect. She sat down slowly, placing her bag beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the cafe seemed louder than usual, every clink of a cup, every muffled laugh, piercing the tension like tiny splinters. Then she said something that made me stop breathing for a second. "I'm sorry you had to wait so long," she said, not the apology I had imagined. Not the explanation I had rehearsed. Just that. A simple, polite acknowledgement that somehow carried years of unspoken truths. I leaned forward, trying to read her expression. Trying to find the version of closure I had dreamed of. "Why?" I asked. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. "Why did you disappear?" She tilted her head. Hesitated, then gave me an answer that sounded certain, deliberate, almost rehearsed. "I didn't disappear for anyone else," she said. I blinked. For a moment, the world tilted. All those late-night speculations, all the assumptions I had built my anger around, suddenly felt fragile. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already feared the answer. She leaned back, calm, her eyes meeting mine. "I left because of you." Her words hung in the air, heavy and precise. "I left because of you." I froze. Part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to argue, but mostly I just tried to process the weight behind her tone. She wasn't blaming someone vague. She wasn't even blaming life or circumstance. She was blaming me. "For years, I thought it was easier to disappear than to explain," she continued, voice soft but unshakable. "I didn't want to hurt you any more than I already had. But staying would have been worse." I opened my mouth, closed it, and opened it again. Nothing came out. I felt dizzy, like the world had flipped inside my chest. "You think I left because of someone else?" she asked. A faint edge of disbelief creeping in. "That you imagined a boyfriend, some man I ran off with?" "That's not it at all." I swallowed hard, a slow, tight knot forming in my throat. "Then why?" I whispered, barely loud enough for her to hear. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. "Because I couldn't keep living in the version of us that existed in your head. You made me small without even trying. Every time I brought something up, it was ignored. Every time I asked for honesty, I got assumptions. I wanted to be seen, and you were looking at a memory, not me." Her gaze softened, but it didn't let me off the hook. "I left to protect myself. Not to hurt you. Not for anyone else. I just needed to be free from the person you thought I was." I sat back, heart pounding. I realized, painfully, that everything I had spent years imagining, the other man, the vanishing act, the betrayal, was a misdirection I had built from my own insecurities. The closure I had waited for, prayed for, hunted, it was here, but it wasn't relief, it was clarity, and clarity, I realized, sometimes feels heavier than confusion. I didn't speak for a long time. The cafe noise continued around us, cups clinking, orders being called out, the faint hiss of the espresso machine, but it felt like a different world, one I wasn't a part of anymore. I kept staring at her, trying to map the person sitting in front of me to the years I had imagined, to the silence that had haunted me, to all the anger I had nursed quietly. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. "So you're saying it was never about someone else?" She shook her head, slowly, deliberately. "No. It was never about him. Or anyone else. It was about the way we were. Or weren't. About the space we left between us and how it grew so wide that I couldn't cross it anymore." I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. A part of me wanted to argue, to claim she had misread me, that I hadn't meant to make her feel unseen. But another part, the part that had carried the years of longing, the late-night searches, the false stories I told myself, felt a strange relief. It wasn't the relief I expected. It wasn't light or freeing. It was sharp and uncomfortable, like a splinter finally being pulled out after years of trying to ignore it. I spent so long thinking I'd understand if I found the truth. I admitted quietly. I thought closure would fix me. She reached across the table and placed her hand near mine, not touching, just close enough to feel the hesitation between us. Closure doesn't fix things, she said. It just gives you the map to move on, even if the journey is hard. I nodded, though my chest felt tight. The truth had been waiting for me all this time, but it wasn't the story I wanted. It wasn't tidy or satisfying. It was just real, and maybe that was worse than not knowing at all. I left the cafe without looking back. The spring air felt sharp in my lungs, bracing me for something I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to call her, beg for some kind of reassurance, anything to make the years of confusion feel worth it. But another part of me knew that doing so would only trap us both in the past we couldn't undo. The truth weighed on me differently than I expected. It didn't feel like freedom. It didn't feel like justice. It just existed. I had chased ghosts, built stories, imagined betrayals that weren't there. And now that the story was gone, all that remained was the raw, unvarnished fact: we had been two people who grew apart, and no amount of searching could change that. I spent the next few days replaying our conversation, each word like a small hammer reshaping the walls I had built around my anger and hurt. The relief I had hoped for never came. Instead, I felt something heavier, a clarity that demanded reflection, acceptance, and action I wasn't ready to take. I thought about reaching out again, about trying to rebuild, or at least get some small sense of connection. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not while the echoes of what I imagined still lived inside me. Sometimes, at night, I still scrolled through old messages, lingering on lines that once seemed insignificant. I read her words over and over, each time noticing something I missed. Something that explains a little more, but never everything. Closure had arrived, but it hadn't healed me. It had only set me free, free to finally see the truth, free to carry the weight of it alone, free to decide what comes next. And that's the part no one tells you: clarity doesn't always make you whole. Sometimes it just leaves you standing in the empty space between what you thought you knew and what you finally understand.